So I appreciate all of you making time to be here with me today. And I want today to be like a pretty open conversation. I would love it. Like, it's cool if you have your camera off, but I would love it if you participated, like either in the chat or just unmuting and speaking up when you have a question or when you have a thought. I always like to begin my presentations by setting an intention. And I get my inspiration for this from activist Adrienne Marie Brown, and she makes this really important point that every time we're in a room with somebody, whether it's like an in-person room or a virtual space, we have an opportunity for connection. And a lot of times we take this for granted. Like when we're standing in line at the grocery store, we're like walking around certain places, or when we're just in a Zoom room together and we don't know who else is in the room. There's so much opportunity for connection there that can go overlooked. And so I would like us to just for a brief moment, reflect on what kinds of connections you'd like to make today. So like, what do you want to get out of the session today? What is your intention for coming? Like, why did you show up? And what do you hope to get out of the session today? If you don't mind sharing in the chat your intentions, then I can read a couple of them out loud. Or if anyone wants to unmute and share your intention, you're welcome to do that. So I'll give you just 1 minute to think about that. Why did you come here? And what do you hope to get out of the session today? Okay, so Martha shared in the chat, she said, I want to learn more of the fine points to look for in being more culturally sensitive. Thank you so much for sharing. So as we get started, I want to just share a couple of things. When we talk about things like inclusion and diversity, things tend to get tense, and there's a lot of fear involved with speaking up and asking questions. So I want us all throughout the session to be, of course, respectful and to recognize that we're all coming from different places. And so we might have different approaches, different questions, different perspectives. At the same time, though, there are times where you might feel uncomfortable with something that's being said, not because you're necessarily personally offended, but because it challenges the way that you've thought about something in the past. And I want to encourage you to sit with that discomfort, not if you're offended by something that somebody said to you specifically, no racist remarks, sexist remarks, things like that. But if someone is providing a different approach or a different way of thinking about something, sitting in discomfort can oftentimes open up opportunities for productive discussion. So we're not always going to keep learning about diversity and inclusion if we're not pushed beyond the boundaries of what we know to learn about a different perspective. So just encouraging that type of productive listening. Also think about in participation, who is and who isn't speaking. So I love participation, especially in Zoom rooms where people have their camera off. It's really like stressful sometimes, and you're like, it's just hard, right? So sometimes you want to participate a lot, but I encourage you to consider how often you're participating in connection to how often other people are having a chance to speak. Or maybe if other people are holding up and doing all the work of participating, maybe it's your turn to step up and do some participation as well. So think about, and not just in this space, but in any space that you find yourself in meetings and conversations, thinking about from a big bird's eye view perspective, who is and who isn't speaking? How are you taking up space in this conversation? Do you need to make more contributions? Do you need to step back and let others make contributions? So thinking about those things can be really important. Another thing is, when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, a lot of times people share really difficult experiences that they've had, especially if we're talking about things like racism and sexism and homophobia, right? People might share an experience that they have. Our job in those situations is truly just to listen, not to give unsolicited advice unless a person has asked for that advice, not to necessarily say, oh yes, me too, because of these reasons, but really just to listen and honor that person's space that they've created and honor the fact that they felt safe enough to share that information with us. Next, being open to questions and to conversation, but also being really mindful of your boundaries, especially if you're a person of color who's always having to contribute to these conversations. There are times where you might hit a boundary and say, like, I don't have anything left to say. Like, my lived experience is my lived experience. I don't want to continue engaging in this dialogue. Or you might ask questions of others, right? So thinking about how are you going to be open to questions, but also what are your limits so that you don't feel overburdened through the conversation. And then finally, asking questions is always good. It's good to ask questions, but ask them from an honest and good place, not necessarily to try to catch somebody or to try to just say something you want to say. Rather than asking a pretend question, you can just make your statement directly. So these are just some groundwork for our conversation today that I also share when I do work with different organizations, when I'm meeting with them and doing different types of consulting. We want to create a space where we all feel comfortable. And that means being mindful of who's speaking, who's not speaking, how we're asking questions, and also, being open to the possibility that we might hear something we disagree with, and being open to sitting with that and trying to figure out, like, what does it mean and what does it mean for me? I also want to encourage everybody to, I would love for this to be a dialogue. So I would encourage you to unmute and ask questions if you have questions, or if you just want to contribute something, or if you've had a similar experience to what I'm discussing at your organization and you want to talk about it a little more and get others' perspective. The floor is open, so please feel free to unmute and ask questions as needed. Okay, so I want to start by thinking about the differences between positionality and identity, because I think these two terms get used as synonyms a lot. They get used interchangeably, and there's not a lot of time where we stop to think about, well, what are the differences between my identity, who I am, and my positionality, which is how I navigate the world. So identity, you can think about identity categories along these lines on this table: ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, sex, race, sexual orientation, national origin, what your first language is, what your citizenship status is, what your education level is, your religion, spiritual orientation, where were you raised, like an urban community, rural community, so on and so forth. And I gave some examples here, and I want to give you 1 minute, literally, you don't have to share this out loud, but 1 minute to write down or jot down or just think about what your identity is along some of these categories. And maybe there's categories I've missed because there's so many different types of identity and categories of identity. So take a moment just to think about what your identity is along some of these categories, if that makes sense. You can just think on it for a second. Okay, so we all know we have multiple identities, right? Our identities is how we identify, how we classify ourselves, our lived experience, how we present visually. Identity and positionality are different because positionality helps us think about the intersections of our identity. So not just ethnicity, not just race, not just gender, but the intersections, how all of these things work together in different contexts. So our positionality actually changes as we navigate different spaces. One thing I want to point out here, and this is from the work of Patricia Hill Collins, who is one of the people who's largely invested in intersectionality and Black feminist theory. And one of the things she points out too is when we do racial equity work or when we do diversity work, a lot of times we think about identity on a flat scale. So what this means is we want to be inclusive to everyone, right? That we want to be inclusive to everyone. We want to include the queer community. We want to include the Black community. We want to include the Latinx community in our programming. A lot of times when we're advocating or working with different advocacy organizations, everyone has their perspective. So when someone says, I'm a disabled person, I have these needs in a space, then someone else might say, yes, and I'm a woman and I have these needs in a space. When we talk about identity, Patricia Hill Collins points to this, when we talk about identity just on a singular axis, so just on a level of what is relevant to us, and when we have conversations about inclusion where all identities are sort of equally represented, what happens is we flatten the differences and the impact that these intersections of identity have on our lived experiences. So Patricia Hill Collins says that if the categories of race, class, gender, among others, are equivalent and potential substitutes for one another, then the systems of power that underline intersectionality are similarly equivalent. And we want to avoid this because all of these identity levels or all of these identity categories are not the same. They all have very different impact in how someone navigates the world. So making a space inclusive to the LGBTQIA community and people of color and women requires us to look beyond just one identity category and to advocate beyond just one identity category and think about positionality and the intersections of these identities. So I'll pause there. Does anybody want to say anything? Did this resonate with anyone?
Hi, Laura.
Mhm.
Hi, I'm Chloe Greene. I'm from the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Sorry to speak up right when you change the slide.
No, please speak up.
I was going to say I've never seen an identity table breakdown that included things like language or things about citizenship status, or even like those are things I consider with identity, but I'm glad to see it represented on something. I think that's important. I think especially in the area of Maryland where I live, I do live around a large population of people who are undocumented or working on citizenship, and that plays a huge factor in a lot of things. So yes, I appreciate seeing that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your comment. And I mean, these are things that I'll continue learning about too, right? So we have to think about identity not just on a one-dimensional level, but on multiple dimensions. And when we're trying to make inclusive events or inclusive programming, when we say for everybody, what does that really mean? And who do we consider and who do we not consider? So thank you so much for pointing that out.
Laura,
Go ahead.
we have a question in the chat asking if these slides will be made available after the presentation.
Absolutely, I'm happy to share. Happy to share. Any other questions? Questions are great. So when thinking about identity, right, we know ourselves, we know where we come from, we know what our first language is, what our documentation status is, we know what our ethnic background is. The thing is, everybody else in the world doesn't necessarily know that, and they don't necessarily know that when they first meet us. So when we think about positionality, we have to think about not just how we identify ourselves, but also how we are being identified by others and how the intersections of our identities are represented to other people. So this is something that I continue learning about, especially identifying as a Latina. When I identify as a Latina, I was born in South America. My first language is Spanish. And there are certain levels of marginalization that come from that, especially being in academia. Latinos are still less than 2% of tenure track professors in the US, right? So there are certain levels of marginalization that come from that. However, when I step out into the grocery store or when I have an interaction with a police officer, I am a white person. And because my race is different from my ethnicity, and the different levels of identity that I know about myself are not levels of identity that are going to be acknowledged or recognized by other people right away. Does that mean that I'm not a Latina, that I don't experience marginalization, and that I'm not this or that? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that when I think about my marginalization, I also have to think about my privilege. Because when I encounter different people, white supremacy kind of dominates everything in our society. And so I'm going to benefit from how whiteness is positioned in our society in every space that I inhabit. And I give you that example, not to be like, oh, look at Laura, she's thinking about these things, but for all of us to think about those things when we're building programs with each other, when we're welcoming community members into our spaces. Positionality is not just about how we identify, which is very important, but it's also about how we're seen in the world, how we walk through the world, how we engage with the world, because that really impacts our lived experience, our historical experience, our contemporary experience, and it really impacts what spaces we're going to feel comfortable being in and what spaces we're not going to feel comfortable being in. So it's something really important to think about. So I want to give you a couple of scenarios to help us think about not just our identity, right? We thought about our identity, but about our positionality. So here's one, and I would love it if people would just jump in. So the scenario is, imagine that you receive an invitation to go to a community event. So you see it on social media or you see the flyer somewhere. What goes through your mind and what factors influence your decision to attend? So like, what do you have to think about before deciding to attend a community event? If anybody wants to jump in here.
The first thing I think of is what else is on my calendar.
What else is on my calendar? I am busy. I work. I have things going on. Absolutely. What else?
Who's going to be there?
Who's going to be there? Exactly. Who's going to be there and who's not going to be there, right? Like, who is at this table? If they say this is an event about good food, who's cooking? Like, what food do they mean? And who's going to be there? Who's not going to be there? Absolutely. What else?
I would
How
say
far away
age.
is it?
How far away is it? Do I have to drive there? Am I taking a bus there? Somebody else said something.
I said age, like what age group is going to
What
be
age group?
predominant?
Yes. What age group is going to be predominant? Yes, absolutely. Like, who is the audience for this event? Do I fit in there, right? Do I fit in? Am I represented? Am I welcome there? Is this for me, or is this something that I should pass along to my kids or my younger friends or my older friends? Absolutely. What else?
Some of the comments in the chat are, is it close to my home? Will I know anyone there? Cost, and why do I want to go?
Why do I want to go? Cost, absolutely. Does it cost anything? And not just the entrance fee, right? You can say this is a free event, but is it going to cost me an Uber ride? Is it going to cost me a bus ticket? Is it going to cost me babysitting costs? Is it going to cost me missing out on work to attend this event, right? All of these things, and like picturing these scenarios, are envisioning the different positionalities that our community members embody, right? And does it include things like race, gender, sexual orientation, documentation, status, language? Absolutely. Because if you don't speak English, the first thing you're thinking about is like, can I even understand this flyer? Is it in my language? Will people be there who speak my language? If not, why would I want to go, right? So thinking about positionality is not just one identity category, but it's all of these different factors. Let's try a couple more. You're
And-
starting, go ahead.
I was gonna say, we also have, is it physically accessible? Who might I want to join with me? How long is it? And how will attending benefit me or the people I am around?
Absolutely. Is it accessible? Can my wheelchair fit there or not, right? So thinking about all of these different aspects is so important, and thinking about it just on one identity lens is not going to cut it. So making an event for Latinos in Florida, right? Still, all of these different factors play a role, because identity and positionality are fluid and they're multi-layered. What about if you're starting a new job and tomorrow is your first day? What's going through your mind?
We have,
How do I
what do
fit in?
wear? Am I dressed properly?
Yes.
Do I have the time?
Do I have the time? Absolutely. Am I dressed properly? What are people going to think of me? Who are my coworkers? What other things?
Will I fit in, making a good first impression?
Will I be judged for this or that, for my appearance? Will I be judged because of my race? Will I be judged because of my physical presentation in some way? Will I be judged because of my accent, right? These are all things that people from different positionalities have to consider. And if you're on the flip side, if you're the employer, these are all the things that maybe you're not naturally inclined to consider, but you should. Did this person have to get up at 5 a.m. to take a bus to get to work? So if they're late, is it because they're lazy, or is it because they're in a positionality that requires all of that extra levels of attention?
We
If
also
someone-
have
Mhm.
other comments here. What if I am not up to the tasks? How many
Mhm.
people will I have to talk to? Will I be the only one of like me there? I
Yes.
hope I know my job well. How is my supervisor going to treat me?
Yes. Will I be the only one like me there? That's such a big question. And for people from marginalized communities and from marginalized positionalities, this is an everyday question for every space, not just work, for every space that you inhabit. And so being welcoming, right? If we want to be welcoming as institutions, requires us to think about positionality on multiple layers, and not just think about how we envision the world, but how others envision the world, and not just think about how we identify. I might say, well, I'm a Latina, like we're all, we're all considered people of color. So like everybody should be comfortable here. But if I'm the only representation of diversity in a space, it is not a welcoming space, right? It is not a space where people are going to feel like there are others like them there. So thinking about identity, positionality, their interactions is really important. Last one, you're preparing to visit a new doctor tomorrow. What goes through your mind as you prepare? I'll pull up the chat.
Does he run on time?
Does he run on time? How long is this going to take? Absolutely. will they actually listen to my concerns, especially if historically it's been largely documented that they don't listen to people like me, right? Will my insurance be accepted? How much is this going to cost me? Like, people go to doctor's appointments and their doctor's talking to them. And I've had this experience, you know, in my own family, and like thinking about how expensive is this? Maybe they charge by the minute. I need to get out of here. Don't omit your medical issues. I hope the doctor knows what's wrong with me. What questions are they going to ask me? What documents am I going to have to show? Do I need to show my documentation just to show up to the emergency room? If so, I don't want to go, right? I don't want to go because the threat or the risk of going is so high that I'd rather not seek medical care. So again, when we think about, well, my organization is welcoming, it welcomes everybody, everybody's welcoming here, or welcomed here. What are we requiring of people to be there? What risks are they taking? And what do we mean by welcoming, right? These are all questions to ask ourselves when we're thinking about positionality. Thank you so much for your participation. So just a summary, positionality is fluid. It changes based on context. How we're perceived in one context is very different than how we might be perceived in another. It's not just about how you see yourself, but also about how others see you. And this is an important element that's often ignored. What is the equivalence of the interaction between your oppressions and your privileges, right? So these are interdependent and co-constituted. So what this means is you may have different levels of marginalization that you yourself experience, but you also have different levels of privilege, and those two things are always together and interacting and changing based on who else is in the room. So doing a positionality exercise and thinking about these things from a complex and nuanced perspective is really important whenever we do any kind of programming, whenever we want to establish a culturally sensitive space. What do we mean? What cultures? Who are we talking about? How are we including? And the thing is, you know, to be honest, we're never going to be fully inclusive. An event that is fully inclusive to everybody, an initiative, a museum exhibit that's fully inclusive doesn't exist. But we have to be mindful of who are we intentionally including and who is being excluded in those interactions, right? Understanding it's never going to be perfect, but who do we have in mind when we think about our target audience, our target user, our target community? I think those things are important. So I won't have you do this because just for the sake of time, but this is an exercise I actually borrowed from Alexandra Sonaitis, who's here, and I think it's really important. When you think about identity and you want to consider positionality, she positions it on 3 different levels. So there's your identity number 1, the ways in which the state, like the US government and other countries see you. So how are you defined? How are you classified by the state? 2, the ways in which people that you encounter daily see you. So the people who you see at the grocery store, the people you see walking, you know, through the park, the people you see when you're walking your dog. How do they encounter and read and see you? That is part of your positionality. It may not necessarily be your full identity. It may not be how you define yourself, but it is how you're seen in the world, how you navigate the world. And then your 3rd layer of identity is how you see yourself, the things that you know about yourself, right? You might see yourself as a person who's very committed to equity and inclusion and who is very welcoming. But if people don't see you that way, because historically people who look like you have not been welcoming, have not been inclusive, then what work can you do to demonstrate that inclusivity and those intentions and that goodwill to people, right? Because it's not automatically granted to you just because you say, oh, I'm a nice person and I'm welcoming and everyone's welcome here. It's about how other people see you, what other interactions you might have as well. So just thinking about those things and interrogating those things can be really helpful, I found, in building culturally inclusive programming. So a concept that comes up a lot when we're thinking about culturally inclusive programming, when we're thinking about diversity inclusion, and this is a word that I almost hate to use now because I feel like everybody throws it out there to just mean different identities. So in that first category or table that I showed, you know, all those different identities, people think that intersectionality means just pick a couple of those off that menu of identities. But I want to make clear that intersectionality was a concept developed by lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw and by the Combahee River Collective, specifically to describe the marginalization of Black women based on the interlocking connections between gender and race. Now, I'm not a critical race theorist, so I'm not an expert on this, but it's important to think about the root of a word when we're using that word to describe our programming. If we say we want to be intersectionally inclusive, we can't do that without recognizing where that word intersectional came from. That word intersectional was developed by a lawyer to help Black women especially advocate for themselves in the workplace. Black women were getting fired in the workplace because they were the last, there was a recession and they were the last people to be hired. So Black women were the people getting fired at the highest rate at the time that this term was developed. The reason why they were the last hired, which means they were the first fired, was because women couldn't be hired for a long time and Black people could not be hired for a long time. So who were the last people to get hired? It was Black women. So they were fired at an alarming rate, and there was no clause in the law for them to file a discrimination lawsuit against their employer based on the intersection of race and gender. Why? Because the employer could say, but of course we welcome women here. Look at all the white women we have. And of course we welcome Black people into this company. Look at all the Black men we have. There was no category where Black women could file a rightful complaint for discrimination based on gender and race. And so intersectionality is rooted in that connection between gender and race. And we can't really detract or abstract that and say, this is an intersectionally inclusive event because we're thinking about ethnicity and sexual orientation. You have to also think about race. So I'm just leaving these citations with you because I think this is a term I've seen be thrown around a lot. And I want us to be mindful of when we talk about intersecting identities and when we talk about intersectionality, it's really important to mark race, even if that race is white, right? White is a race. You can say white. You can say this is a group of white queer people who are at this event. That lets me know who that event includes and does not include. So let me give you an example here of what I mean and why I think this is important. So recently, this tweet was shared by somebody. It was publicly shared. I asked them if I could use it in a presentation. We had a discussion with them. It was fine. And of course, I'm not sharing their full name. But the tweet they shared was, hello, old and new friends. A reintroduction. I'm Ashley, a queer first-gen disabled psych PhD. Right now, I'm loving autumn colors, spooky things, and my new short hair. So she just shared this tweet. It's a great tweet. It's a fun tweet. But is this tweet an intersectionally inclusive or thinking about identity from an intersectional approach? Does anyone have a perspective? And you can totally disagree with me.
I think it's partially intersectional and inclusive. I mean, obviously, like you said, with the events, there's no completely 100% inclusive event. It doesn't exist, right? So I think like this, yeah, there's a lot left out, but there's also a lot included and grabs your attention. You know this person's queer, I'm assuming first gen means immigrant, maybe like first gen American, or I don't know what I'm not sure what that means, to be honest with you. So I would probably ask this person, what do they mean by first generation? But disabled tells me something. It doesn't tell me the specific disability, but it tells me partially. And that they are they have a degree, that they're well educated, they have a PhD. So that's actually quite a lot of information, letting us know all the multiple facets and intersection of that person. But we don't know what race they are, and we don't know their economic background, and that there's a lot of other things that we don't know. But it's more than just, hi, I'm Bob, nice to meet you.
Absolutely, right. So she does tell us a lot about herself, not her pronouns that I'm using, she, and maybe I shouldn't be, right? And doesn't address race. And so when we think about identity through an intersectional perspective, we have to consider race because this was founded in discussions of race, right? So thinking about, is this a white person? Again, what does first generation mean, right? What does it mean in terms of education? Like, you're the first person to attend college. Does it mean something else? There's so many different layers to identity. And a lot of times when we're thinking about naming our identities, we name the things that are most important to us, but we don't often think about how the world views us, right? So I might have all of these identities and that are very marginalized identities for a lot of different reasons, but I don't name my whiteness, which is my privilege, right? So when we think about identity through an intersectional lens, we have to think about the things that make us a marginalized population, but the things that also make us a privileged population in lots of different ways, and how those things are always in conversation. So I just wanted to share that as an example. And of course, it's impossible to list all aspects of your identity in one tweet. You only have like 280 characters, but identity is very fluid, right? And identity is very much tied to not just how we see ourselves, but how others see us. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we're describing our own identities to different stakeholders. Think about not just the identities that might demark your marginalization, but also the identities that might demark your privileges, especially if you're working with an institution where you need a certain level of education to be at, right? So you might identify with all these different communities, but you're representing a very privileged institution. So that's going to influence how people interact with you. So finally, intersectionality is not just a frame for describing oppression, and this is something Patricia Hill Collins points us to as well. It's a critical social theory that can help us describe privileges and forms of resistance. So a lot of times people think about intersectionality as, let me tell you all the different oppressed communities or under-resourced communities that I come from. But what she tells us is, no, intersectionality can help us recognize our privilege, and it can also help us recognize when we do activist work, when we resist white supremacy, through what angles are we resisting it? What identities, intersections of identity help us push back against white supremacy? And that's something we can all think about in our organizations, right? Not just what representation do we have in terms of race and gender and disability status, but based on those experiences, what is our orientation to resistance? What is our orientation to activism? What frameworks help us build coalitions for action through these different perspectives? Intersectionality is not just about marginalization, it's about naming how the different aspects of our identities shape our positionality in different contexts. So I think that's a really cool thing that I learned from her that I thought I would share along with you. And so this is my final section, then we can move to the Q&A, because this is something that I've had to think about a lot, you know, coming from a Latinx background and not coming from an upper or upper middle class background, but then trying to do community work with communities who are also Latinx and also share similar backgrounds is difficult when I am part of a university or an institution that represents a lot of privilege. So currently part of my work is working at the University of Florida as a faculty member. If I think about representing the University of Florida, like going out to the community or hosting an event at the University of Florida, what is that institutional positionality? The University of Florida is the only state school in the state of Florida, a state with a large population of Black and Latinx students. It's the only state institution whose population of Black students has decreased rather than increased over the last decade. The University of Florida was initially founded as the East Florida Seminary, which was funded and founded by people who were owners of enslaved people. And those people, those families are still the biggest contributors to the University Foundation today. The University of Florida sits on land that was the land of the Tumakua people. Their burial grounds are still on the campus because the campus was built over their burial grounds. This might seem like historical context, but it really does shape how people interact with the University of Florida and how the University of Florida interacts with people. So although I might have great intentions to build a culturally inclusive event with community members, Latinx community members, multilingual community members, I have to be mindful of who am I representing? What is the institution that I'm representing? And how does that institutional positionality interact with my own positionality? And what can I do through an intersectional lens to build a form of resistance and activism and build trust? Is there anything I can do? I'm trying, right? But I think thinking about our institutional positionalities is really important. So we can kind of start to transition to the Q&A, and I can start with this question for all of you. Think about, what is your institutional positionality? How does that positionality influence the work that you do? And how does your institutional positionality intersect or interact with your individual positionality? I think all of those things are going to influence who shows up to our events, who trusts us to come to our events, who trusts us to collaborate with us. And so I think these are good questions to kind of keep in mind. I'll go through the takeaways real quick, and then we can go back and either answer my questions or I can answer your questions. But basically what I wanted to share with you all today is that positionality is fluid. It's always changing. It's not just about how we see ourselves, but also about how others perceive us, how they're going to trust or not trust us. Intersectionality cannot be applied without recognizing race. And you can recognize whiteness as the race, even as you're also talking about other identity categories. That's really important, especially because it marks a certain level of privilege that others do not have who embody those different positionalities. And then institutional positionality is important when designing culturally inclusive programming, because whether we want to believe it or not, like I would never want to say like, I represent the University of Florida, but you know what? When you email me, it says University of Florida, I still represent that university, right? So there is that connection and I'm tied to that institution. So how I navigate the world is still tied to the legacy of that institution, whether I want that to be the case or not. So I just wanted to share these takeaways and open it up for discussion. I can also go back to these previous questions if we want, however we want to do it. Does anyone want to talk about their institutional positionality? I don't know if you've had experiences where you have been at odds, or maybe you have a great institutional positionality of an organization that was, founded for amazing reasons.
There's nothing in the chat quite yet.
Okay, feel free to ask, or you can just comment on anything, or you can say, I think you're wrong about X, Y, and Z. That's totally viable.
As we are thinking.
Okay, thinking is good. Yeah, thinking is good. I know it's a lot, and I will definitely share the slides with people. And these are just ways that I've come to terms, or that I'm still learning about these terms and things that I found helpful in applying them to my own programming. Okay, someone said they're not sure about my organization's positionality. That's really interesting because one of the assignments I do in my classes is ask students to research the history of the University of Florida and then think about that positionality and think about, what is the history of our organization, and then how does that influence, the mission today or what we do today. So yeah, I think many of us don't know the organization's positionality, and it's a good thing to research to just kind of find out and see.
But you know what, I will say this, that even though I'm not sure how to answer that, I could speak about the community at large. Mm-hmm. Like the community in which my organization sits, both on a county level and then within the town of Columbia. And I find it interesting because the culture of like certain areas of the county are a little different than, like, the West has a little bit different environment than the Southeast does, but we do have a rather diverse population, which I think directly affects, obviously, because that's the community that we serve. Mm-hmm. And having grown up in Columbia, Maryland, I could tell you, all kinds of stories and stuff, but Columbia is maybe not as much today, but at the time of its origination in the late 60s, early 70s, was a very, very unique place because it was one of the few places to be deliberately integrated, to be deliberately designed to welcome everyone. At the time, interracial marriage was still illegal in many places in the country. So people were crossing the border into Maryland and, in order so that they could get married, and then found out that they could live, especially in this area, without risking their lives. Mm-hmm. And so therefore it attracted that kind of mindset. So so that's kind of and that's very different from, like, and I grew up here, so that's very different from places like where I have cousins and relatives in other parts of the country who were in a completely drastically different environment, very, very what's the word? Monotone. They were in a very singular environment, whereas I was in a very diverse, multiple experiences. So it definitely affects your mindset. And hopefully, I hope that that makes us maybe more welcoming than others, but we can always get better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I'm coming at you from Florida, so if some of this stuff
Oh,
seems extreme, it's because it is.
okay.
No, for sure. But
I think, well, I think that's actually also an element of privilege in a way, to grow up in such a diverse environment and being right in between Baltimore and DC. I mean, Washington, DC is extremely, there's much like Paris, France is a very international place because
Mhm.
it's the capital of the country. So when you live close to that kind of environment, you get used to not only seeing people of different colors, but you get used to hearing different languages spoken, um, different appearances and music. The music influence is amazing, you know. So, and then when you go other places that don't have that influence, you notice it. It's very, very noticeable. So, you know, so in a way, that's also, I see that also as a privilege. So I'm able to, as you know, to enter and visit other places with a perspective that maybe they don't have.
Mhm.
But I'm still open to, you know, listening to those who have the perspectives that I don't have. You know, being a white woman, I'm not going to understand, you know, I don't, I still, I can only understand but so much. So I have to learn when to listen. So anyway, I'm going to shut up now.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think you're spot on. Thank you. Does anyone else have? I can just move on to the question slide. We can talk about anything that you can take away from this presentation and apply to your work, or things you wanted to comment on, or feedback.
So I'm currently stuck on just the thought around the institutional positionality, especially from the aspect of government, right? And so historically, government has upheld a lot of the marginalization of people, especially in this country. And so just when we look at like positionality, right, and history and background, the foundation of a lot of governments is marginalization, right? But then when you look at current day, and especially as Karen was expressing around like the inclusivity and the diversity, it's kind of like there's an effort to do more and do better. But again, just the whole concept and idea around like the foundation and making sure that that is acknowledged and truthful and transparent. Honestly, it's just an interesting concept that I never really thought about, and it's kind of like blowing my mind right now.
Yeah, I think the transparency is so important, because when you're trying to do, you know, or have new initiatives from a government perspective, I think it can mean a lot to people to even just say like, I know we have like screwed up so bad, you know, and we continue to, and there's so many bad things about this, but this is why this is different, or this is why, you know, this might be a new opportunity. I think just that acknowledgement can go a long way sometimes. Thank you so much for sharing. Anybody else want to jump in? Are there other like concrete or things that you wanted to take away that maybe we didn't get to touch on, or things that maybe resonated with you that could use some more clarification?
So we have a long message in the chat. It says, it is necessary to acknowledge and identify one's own background, privileges, identities, etc. Well, at what point is that no longer enough? Thinking about how students can benefit from having a role model that comes from the same or similar background. I've rewritten this thought many times, probably not explaining myself properly.
No, I think you are explaining yourself in an excellent way, Jillian, and I think this is so true. And I think about this with academic research. So I've published academic research, and this has become a common practice now where we say our positionality in academic research. So we might say, me, a white woman from this background who identifies like this, is writing this, this work. But what that turned into, and this is from the field of education, was so many people being like, me, a white woman teacher, am now going to do this work in a school that's predominantly Black and brown students. And people would say, well, okay, that's fine. Like, okay, you identify your positionality, you say you have this privilege. How did that shape the entire aspect of your collaboration? How did you keep that in mind as you did the entire project, not just at the beginning? Like, yes, I acknowledge my privilege. Thank you very much. Let me go on and do all the things in the same way that I would do them normally, right? But thinking of acknowledging positionality is about how is that going to shape your interaction? And that never takes away from exactly what you're pointing to, the need for students to have a role model that comes from a similar background as them, right? So in addition to acknowledging our positionality, we can make space for teachers who look like those students, who come from a similar background, to do that work as well. And that's, you know, that's the real acknowledgement of privilege, I think, is creating that space or working to create that space. So I appreciate you calling that out. People are sharing great recommendations in the chat, so that's great. Any other comments? I don't know, Jillian, if you wanted to say more or if anybody else wanted to say more. All right, well, thank you all so much for listening and for participating. Feel free to email me if you have any like follow-up questions or anything. This is my handle for Twitter if you prefer that route. But I really appreciate everybody taking the time to be here today, to share your experiences and to participate. That was really important and hard. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Laura, for this particular wonderful session. We really appreciate it. I think this is also, for this particular kind of conversation, a really part of what we're actually doing for this particular series, Designing Inclusive Programming. So we can definitely think about the different ways we can become better and also thinking about our biases, but also thinking about how we can reach out to diverse communities as well. This will be our session, like the end of a session for October. So we're actually gonna have other sessions coming up. So we're gonna have sessions in November and some in December as well. So in November, I would say November 3rd, we're gonna have a conversation around like thinking around the 250th celebration. I know the first session, some of you mentioned about this, like especially if you want to create events or create programming around the 250th celebration of US. How do you do this? How do you reach out to different communities? How do you include them? And also, how do you envision things differently? What can we learn from different folks around their perspective on this topic? We actually will put in the chat, I will say the session, but also in our thank you email, I will say we'll save all those particular comments or resources that were shared as well, so we can actually share with you along with the date and also the registration details for the next sessions that we're gonna have. On that note, I wanna thank everybody for attending today's session. I also wanna thank Laura for agreeing to facilitate the session and also for this wonderful insight. I also want to thank Lucia Fabiani for capturing this moment that we shared together today. So you can actually see some of the comments inside. How do we connect? Identity, positionality, and also being careful in considering our own privilege and acting in consequences, like role models, like the different in the graphic. And we also will share that with you as well. So thank you for attending today's session. We appreciate it and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.